The spring of 1959 arrived in New York City not with a gentle whisper, but with the heavy, humid breath of a metropolis waking up from a long, bitter freeze. It was the kind of weather that made the asphalt sweat and the air shimmer above the grates. Sunlight, thick and golden, bounced off the chrome bumpers of taxicabs and illuminated the towering concrete canyons of Manhattan. But the sunlight, much like the money and the power in this city, did not touch everyone equally. In 1959, New York was a city sliced into fragments by invisible, razor-sharp lines. These were borders drawn not with ink on a municipal map, but with generational wealth, quiet privilege, and the undeniable color of a person's skin. Below 110th Street, the world belonged to the elite. It was a world of 3 martini lunches at private clubs, inherited fortunes safely tucked into trust funds, and a quiet, hushed authority that never had to raise its voice to be obeyed. But above 110th Street, the air changed, the rhythm changed. This was Harlem, and Harlem, in all its chaotic, beautiful, dangerous glory, belonged to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was the undisputed king, the grand master of the uptown underworld. He was a man who moved comfortably in the darkest shadows, but completely controlled the light. He had fought the Italian mafia, the 5 families who thought they could march uptown and plant their flags, to a bloody, grinding standstill. He had built an empire of numbers, protection, and influence that demanded absolute respect. To the police, he was a ghost they could never quite catch. To the politicians, he was a necessary evil they had to negotiate with in smoke-filled back rooms. But to the people on the avenues of Harlem, Bumpy was something much more complicated. He was the law when the actual law refused to look their way. Yet, behind every king who holds his throne against the wolves, there is a queen who ensures the crown never slips. For Bumpy Johnson, that immovable rock, that unwavering force of nature, was his wife, Mamie Johnson. Mamie was elegance personified. She was not a loud woman, nor was she prone to the flashy, desperate displays of wealth that lesser men's wives favored. She didn't need to be. She carried herself with a quiet, terrifying grace, a poise born of surviving decades in the most dangerous game in America. She knew the immense, crushing weight of her husband's name, and she wore it not as a burden, but as a shield forged of pure titanium. Mamie was a woman of deep culture. She understood fine art, she knew the intricate movements of classical music, and she possessed a photographic memory for the precise cut of a tailored Italian suit. She was the only person on the face of the earth who could look Bumpy Johnson in the eye, tell him he was dead wrong, and live to see him nod in agreement. She was the only person whose disappointment Bumpy truly, deeply feared. On this particular Tuesday morning, the Harlem air outside their window smelled of roasted peanuts, exhaust fumes, and the sweet yeast of the corner bakery. Inside their spacious, impeccably decorated apartment, the atmosphere was quiet, domestic, and perfectly ordered. Mamie stood before her large vanity mirror, carefully adjusting the collar of her navy blue tailored suit. It was a Chanel piece, understated but radiating authority. Bumpy sat in a heavy leather armchair in the corner of the bedroom, a cup of black, steaming coffee resting on his knee. He was watching her. He always watched her with a mixture of profound awe and fierce, territorial protection. Bumpy was dressed sharply, even for a Tuesday morning, wearing a charcoal gray suit with a crisp white shirt, a silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. His fedora rested on the side table next to a thick, heavy roll of $100 bills bound by a rubber band. Mamie was preparing for a charity gala scheduled for that coming weekend. It wasn't just another social gathering. It was a major fundraiser for a brand new youth community center right in the heart of Harlem. It was an event where the uptown elite, the doctors, the lawyers, the business owners, and the quiet power brokers would gather to show their collective strength and solidarity. It was a night that required a statement. Bumpy took a slow sip of his coffee, his dark, calculating eyes following the movement of Mamie's hands as she selected a string of genuine pearls from her jewelry box. "You need a dress that does the talking for you, Mamie," Bumpy said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the quiet room. "I want you walking into that ballroom looking like you own the lease on the building. Show them exactly who we are. No half measures." Mamie smiled, a small, knowing expression that touched the corners of her mouth but barely moved her eyes. She picked up the thick roll of hundreds from the side table, feeling the dense weight of the paper against her palm, and slipped it smoothly into her black leather handbag. "I know exactly what I am looking for, Ellsworth," Mamie replied, her tone smooth and completely unbothered. "There's a specific cut I want, something bold. I am going downtown to get it." Bumpy's brow furrowed just a fraction of an inch, a microscopic tightening of the muscles around his jawline. Downtown meant below the line. It meant Fifth Avenue. It meant entering a world that smiled to your face while keeping a hand on its wallet, a world that tolerated their money but despised their presence. "You want me to send Junie with you?" Bumpy asked, the protective instinct flaring up instantly. Junie Bird was Bumpy's right hand, his most feared enforcer, a man who spoke in whispers but left roaring echoes of destruction in his wake. "To buy a dress?" Mamie chuckled softly, pulling a pair of pristine white silk gloves onto her hands, smoothing the delicate fabric over her slender fingers. Heavens, no. Junie standing in a boutique would make the salesgirls faint. "Tommy is downstairs waiting with the car. I will be perfectly fine. I am shopping, Ellsworth, not going to war." Bumpy stared at her for a long moment, the heavy silence stretching between them. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Just be back before the streetlights come on." The air changes when the sun goes down. Mamie walked over, leaned down, and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, smelling the sharp, clean scent of bay rum aftershave and the faint, lingering metallic ghost of gun oil that always seemed to follow him. "I'll be home soon," she promised. Down on the street level, the pristine jet-black Lincoln Continental was idling at the curb, its massive engine purring with a low, threatening rumble. Standing by the rear passenger door was Tommy. Tommy was young, sharp-eyed, and fiercely loyal. He was one of Bumpy's drivers, a kid from the neighborhood who had earned his place in the organization by keeping his mouth shut, his eyes open, and his hands steady on the steering wheel. He wore a neat dark suit and a driver's cap, but the bulge under his left arm gave away his true profession. As Mamie emerged from the building, Tommy immediately stood up straighter, snapping to attention. He pulled the heavy, armored rear door open with a smooth motion. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Tommy said, his voice laced with absolute, unwavering respect. "Good morning, Tommy," Mamie replied, sliding onto the cool leather seat. "Take me down to Fifth Avenue. Maison Delore. It is near 57th Street. Tommy closed the door firmly, a solid, heavy thud that sealed Mamie inside the quiet sanctuary of the Lincoln. He hurried around to the driver's seat, slid behind the wheel, and shifted the massive car into gear. The drive from the heart of Harlem down to the gleaming epicenter of Midtown Manhattan was a study in contrasts. Mamie watched out the tinted window as the scenery slowly shifted, the vibrant, chaotic energy of the uptown streets, the children playing stickball, the men gathered around folding tables playing dominoes, the fruit vendors shouting out their daily prices, gradually faded away. The buildings grew taller, the stonework more ornate, the sidewalks less crowded and far more rigid. As the Lincoln glided past Central Park and crossed the invisible threshold into the high 50s, the air inside the car seemed to grow heavier. This was the luxury district, a stretch of pavement lined with the most exclusive, intimidating boutiques on the face of the planet. It was a neighborhood where the air smelled of expensive French perfume, roasted chestnuts, and unchecked historical arrogance. Tommy pulled the Lincoln up to the curb, parking it smoothly in front of a massive, imposing storefront featuring enormous plate glass windows and heavy brass detailing. The gold leaf lettering on the glass read, Maison Delore. It was a highly exclusive boutique, heavily rumored to be under the quiet protection of the downtown mafia families. It was known for importing one-of-a-kind gowns directly from the fashion houses of Paris and Milan. It was the kind of establishment that fundamentally refused to put price tags on their garments. The philosophy was simple and brutal. If you had to ask the price, you simply did not belong there. Tommy hopped out and opened the rear door. Mamie stepped gracefully onto the pristine gray pavement. She looked immaculate. The navy blue suit, the pearls, the perfectly tailored fit. She looked like royalty stepping out of a carriage. But as she stood on the sidewalk, the glances from the passing pedestrians were not filled with admiration or respect. The wealthy white men in their gray flannel suits and the society women clutching their designer handbags looked at her with narrow, suspicious eyes. In their tightly enclosed, deeply prejudiced world, a black woman standing on this specific stretch of Fifth Avenue was an anomaly. They immediately assumed she was either a domestic worker running an errand for her wealthy employer or someone who was hopelessly, dangerously lost. Mamie felt the heat of their stares, the silent, collective judgment pressing against her skin. She ignored it completely. She had spent a lifetime walking into rooms where she wasn't wanted. She had learned long ago that the greatest weapon against arrogance was absolute, unbreakable composure. "Wait here, Tommy," Mamie said, adjusting the strap of her handbag, her voice smooth and entirely unbothered by the hostile environment. Tommy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes scanning the street, reading the faces of the people walking by. He didn't like the energy here. It felt tight, coiled, ready to snap. He knew the unwritten rules of this city just as well as Bumpy did. "You sure you don't want me to come in with you, Mrs. Johnson?" Tommy asked, his voice dropping an octave, his hand resting casually near the lapel of his jacket where his piece was hidden. "Some of these cats down here, they forget their manners." Mamie offered him a faint, reassuring smile. "I am buying a piece of silk, Tommy, not robbing a bank. I do not need an escort to look at dresses. Keep the engine warm. I will not be long." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked toward the heavy, brass-handled glass door. She reached out with a white-gloved hand and pushed it open. A small, delicate silver bell mounted above the door chimed. It was a crisp, clear, musical sound, but to Mamie, it felt like an alarm bell echoing in a silent vault. The interior of Maison Delore was nothing short of a cathedral dedicated to vanity and excess. The floors were laid with highly polished, gleaming white marble that reflected the light like a mirror. The walls were covered in deep, rich crimson velvet drapery that absorbed the sound from the street outside, creating a hushed, reverent atmosphere. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, casting a warm, flattering, golden light on the handful of gowns displayed on headless silk-wrapped mannequins. It was intimidating by design. Standing near the back of the expansive showroom, meticulously adjusting a locked glass display case filled with imported diamond brooches, was Arthur. Arthur was the owner, the manager, and the self-appointed, ruthless gatekeeper of this exclusive sanctuary. He was a man with a painfully thin, heavily pomaded mustache, hair slicked back so tightly it looked painted onto his skull, and a tailored gray suit that was a fraction of an inch too tight, designed to show off a physique he didn't quite possess. Arthur was a creature entirely fueled by ego and snobbery. He didn't just sell clothes, he sold status, exclusivity, and the intoxicating feeling of being better than the person standing next to you. He took his role as the bouncer of high society very, very seriously, happily kissing the shoes of the wealthy while stepping on the necks of anyone he deemed unworthy. When the delicate silver bell chimed, Arthur stopped polishing the glass and looked up. His eyes landed on Mamie standing just inside the doorway. For a fraction of a second, his calculating brain tried to process the conflicting image in front of him. He saw the expensive, flawless cut of her Chanel suit. He saw the genuine luster of the pearls resting against her collarbone. He recognized quality. But then, his eyes registered the color of her skin, the polite, fawning, retail smile that was perpetually plastered on his face, a smile he used to greet the wives of senators and banking tycoons, instantly vanished. It was replaced by a tight, sour, deeply offended grimace. His lips thinned into a hard line. Mamie felt the temperature in the room plummet. It was a sudden, biting coldness she had experienced 1,000 times before in 1,000 different places. It was the silent, crushing, suffocating weight of polite society's racism. The kind of prejudice that didn't need to use slurs or burn crosses in the night, but rather relied on an invisible, freezing wall of ice designed to make you feel completely, utterly invisible and entirely unwelcome. She didn't let it slow her down for a single heartbeat. Mamie walked further into the store, her posture perfect, her heels clicking rhythmically, a sharp, commanding sound against the polished marble floor. Her dark eyes calmly scanned the room, sweeping past the mannequins wrapped in pale pinks and muted silvers, until her gaze locked onto the center display. There it was. It was a breathtaking, floor-length gown in a shade of red so deep, so vibrant, and so aggressive it looked like freshly drawn blood. It was a masterpiece of imported silk and layered chiffon, draped and pinned with a terrifying architectural precision. The neckline was elegant but daring, the waist cinched tightly, the skirt designed to flow like liquid fire. It wasn't just a dress, it was a weapon. It was exactly the piece she needed to walk into that Harlem ballroom and make every single person in the room stop breathing. Mamie walked slowly toward the center display, her eyes admiring the exquisite craftsmanship. She raised her right hand, the white silk glove glowing under the chandelier light, reaching out to gently touch the delicate, sheer fabric of the sleeve. "Excuse me." The voice cut through the quiet, reverent hum of the boutique, like a rusted razor blade dragging across glass. It was Arthur. He had practically sprinted from behind the jewelry counter, his leather shoes squeaking faintly against the marble, closing the distance between them with a frantic, aggressive, entirely unprofessional energy. He deliberately positioned himself directly between Mamie and the red dress, invading her personal space. His chest was puffed out, his chin raised high in a rigid posture of absolute unearned superiority. "Can I help you with something?" Arthur asked. The words themselves formed a question, but the tone of his voice was a blunt, heavy eviction notice. He didn't offer a bow. He didn't say madam or ma'am. He didn't offer a greeting of any kind. He spoke to her with the flat, commanding impatience one might use when addressing a stray, dirty animal that had somehow wandered into a pristine dining room. "I was just admiring this gown," Mamie said, her voice remaining perfectly calm, even, and beautifully modulated, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "It is a truly beautiful piece of work. The stitching is remarkable." "Is the garment on the display a size 6? Arthur let out a short, breathy, incredibly insulting scoff. He slowly, deliberately looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her leather handbag, his mind calculating, judging, and finding her entirely lacking. He assumed she was just an ordinary woman from uptown, perhaps a school teacher or a nurse who had saved up a few meager dollars and wanted to come downtown to play dress-up for an afternoon. He assumed she had no power, no real money, and absolutely no right to be breathing the purified, expensive air inside his store. "I think you are deeply confused about where you are," Arthur said, his voice dripping with a thick, toxic condescension. He gestured vaguely to the surrounding room. "This is a private, exclusive boutique. Our clientele requires a certain pedigree. The garments in this room are imported. They are one of a kind. And they are very, very expensive. Much more than you could possibly comprehend." Mamie's expression did not change by a single millimeter. She didn't frown. She didn't bristle with indignation. She didn't raise her voice to defend her bank account. She simply looked at Arthur, her dark eyes locking onto his pale, nervous face with a terrifying, dead calm stillness. It was the exact same look Bumpy Johnson gave to rival bosses right before he ordered Junie Bird to end their careers permanently. "I am fully aware of what city block I am standing on," Mamie said softly, the quiet volume of her voice somehow making the words hit harder. "And I am fully aware of how currency works. I did not ask for a financial consultation. I asked if the garment on the display is a size 6. Arthur's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The veins in his neck began to throb. He was not used to being challenged, let alone by someone he viewed as entirely beneath him. He was used to the quiet, embarrassed compliance of people who quickly realized they were out of their depth and hurried back out the door. He opened his mouth, preparing to deliver a much sharper, crueler insult, preparing to officially and loudly order her to leave the premises immediately. Before the words could leave his throat, the silver bell above the front door chimed again, a frantic, jangling sound. The heavy glass door was practically thrown open, and a chaotic whirlwind of expensive fur, overpowering floral perfume, and staggering, blind entitlement swept into the boutique. It was Mrs. Eleanor Sterling. She was the wife of a ruthlessly wealthy Wall Street banking tycoon, a woman whose family name was plastered on hospital wings and museum galleries. She was a prominent, fiercely demanding white socialite who viewed the entire island of Manhattan as her own personal, private playground. She moved with the chaotic energy of a woman who had never been told no in her entire 50 years of life. "Arthur, darling." Mrs. Sterling bellowed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing painfully off the marble walls. She didn't even bother looking at the merchandise. She stomped toward the center of the room, trailing an enormous mink coat behind her. "I need the entire showroom cleared immediately. I have that dreadful charity gala for the mayor on Saturday evening, and I absolutely refuse to wear the same silhouette as that miserable woman from the country club. Clear the floor, Arthur. I need to see everything you have hidden in the back. Now. Arthur's entire physical demeanor shifted in a microscopic fraction of a second. It was a sickening transformation. The arrogant, hostile sneer vanished entirely, instantly replaced by a fawning, desperate, wet smile. His spine seemed to physically bend, his shoulders slouching, as he practically bowed toward the wealthy socialite, his hands wringing together like an anxious servant. Mrs. Sterling. What an absolute honor. Of course. Right this way, madam, Arthur gushed, his voice climbing an octave in his desperation to please. We received a brand new shipment from Paris just this morning that I haven't even put on the floor yet. I knew you would want the first look. It is simply exquisite. Please, make yourself comfortable near the mirrors. Arthur turned his head back to look at Mamie. The fawning, submissive smile he wore for Mrs. Sterling instantly morphed back into a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. In Arthur's mind, Mamie was no longer just a minor annoyance. She had suddenly become a massive, dangerous liability. She was a blemish, a dark stain on the pristine, perfectly controlled image of high society he was desperately trying to present to his most important, highest-paying client. You need to leave, Arthur hissed, leaning in close, dropping all pretense of polite retail etiquette. His breath smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Right now. You are holding up my business. The store is closed for a private fitting. Walk out the door before I have you thrown out. Mamie stood her ground. She planted her feet firmly on the marble. She didn't move a single inch backward. She slowly turned her head and looked over at Mrs. Sterling. The wealthy socialite was busy examining her own reflection in a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror, completely ignoring Mamie, pretending she didn't even exist in the same dimensional plane. Then, Mamie turned her calm, piercing gaze back to Arthur. I believe I was here first, Mamie said. Her voice dropped to a low, dangerous register, a sound as cold and hard as the marble beneath their feet. I am a paying customer. I have cash in my purse to purchase this gown. I will leave this establishment when I have concluded my business, and not 1 second before. Arthur's right eye began to twitch uncontrollably. A cold spike of genuine panic was rising in his chest. If Mrs. Sterling felt even slightly uncomfortable, if she felt that the exclusivity of her favorite boutique had been compromised by allowing the wrong element inside, she would leave. If she left, she would tell her incredibly wealthy friends at the country club. If she told her friends, Arthur's boutique would be socially blacklisted. His entire livelihood would be destroyed in an afternoon. He couldn't let this woman ruin his business. He needed her gone. Immediately. By any means necessary. Arthur raised his right hand and snapped his fingers sharply. It was a loud, cracking sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. From the deep, velvet-draped shadows near the back dressing rooms, a massive figure slowly emerged. It was Arthur's private security. A massive, thick-necked, broken-nosed brute named Sal. Sal wasn't a tailored professional security guard. He wasn't an off-duty cop picking up extra shifts. He was pure, unadulterated street muscle. He was a man hired specifically because Maison Delore paid heavy weekly protection money to the downtown Italian mob to ensure their windows weren't smashed in the night. Sal was the mob's representative on the floor, placed there to ensure the delicate sensibilities of the Fifth Avenue elite were never disturbed by vagrants, thieves, or anyone else the management wanted violently removed. Sal walked forward, his heavy, thick-soled boots thudding ominously against the polished marble. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting dark suit that strained against his wide shoulders. He had the dead, flat eyes of a man who had hurt a lot of people for money and had never lost a minute of sleep over it. He didn't ask questions. He didn't assess the situation or try to de-escalate. He just saw Arthur, his boss, frantically pointing a trembling finger at a black woman who was refusing to leave the store. "Get her out of here, Sal," Arthur barked, his voice trembling with a mixture of panicked rage and desperate fear. He stepped back, putting distance between himself and the impending violence. "Throw her out on the street. Drag her out if you have to. Just get her out of my sight." Mamie finally turned her head to look directly at the approaching guard. She saw the sheer size of him. She saw the dead, hollow look in his dark eyes. She saw the way his massive shoulders rolled forward, the way his heavy, scarred hands slowly balled into tight fists as he closed the distance. For the first time since she had left the safety of Harlem, a sharp, electric flicker of genuine, unpredictable danger sparked in the air. "Do not touch me," Mamie said. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a panicked, high-pitched scream for help. It was a command. It was delivered with the absolute, bone-chilling authority of a queen addressing a peasant who had stepped out of line. It was the voice of a woman who was married to a man who could have this entire building burned to the foundation by midnight. But Sal didn't care about authority. He didn't know who she was. He only cared about orders, and he only respected physical force. He lunged forward. Mamie tried to step backward, her instincts flaring, but the heavy draped fabric of the red dress on the center display blocked her path. She was trapped between the mannequin and the oncoming muscle. Sal reached out with a massive, calloused, meaty hand. He bypassed her shoulder and clamped his thick fingers down hard on Mamie's left wrist. The physical contact was an absolute shockwave. It was a brutal, jarring, entirely unacceptable violation of her person. Sal squeezed. He squeezed with the raw, unthinking power of a man used to breaking bones. His thick fingers dug mercilessly into the delicate, fragile bones of her wrist, completely indifferent to the sudden, agonizing pain he was causing her. Mamie gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, catching painfully in her throat as the pressure spiked. Sal didn't hesitate. He violently yanked her forward, pulling her away from the display case with the sheer, disrespectful force of a man dragging a heavy sack of flour across a warehouse floor. As he pulled her roughly off balance, the fine, expensive, imported white silk of Mamie's left glove caught violently against the sharp, jagged, diamond-encrusted edge of Arthur's pinky ring, who had stepped too close to the scuffle. There was a sickening, terrible tearing sound that seemed to echo louder than anything else in the room. Rip! The pure white silk tore violently open, a jagged slash running all the way from her wrist down to the center of her palm, exposing her dark skin underneath. But Sal didn't stop. He shoved her violently toward the heavy glass front door, his brutal grip tightening even further on her forearm. Mamie could feel the immediate, throbbing, blinding heat of a deep, dark bruise instantly forming on her arm, blossoming under the navy blue sleeve of her Chanel suit. The physical pain was sharp, intense, and radiating up past her elbow, setting her nerves on fire. But the physical pain meant nothing. It was entirely irrelevant compared to the profound, earth-shattering, unforgivable disrespect of the act itself. No one touched Mamie Johnson. No one. Not the police, not the rival bosses, not the politicians. To lay a violent hand on the wife of Bumpy Johnson was not just an assault, it was an act of absolute suicide. Sal pushed her one final, brutal time, letting go of her wrist and shoving her hard in the center of her back, forcing her stumbling backward toward the entrance. Mamie caught her balance just a fraction of an inch before her shoulders slammed against the heavy brass frame of the door. Her leather heels skidded slightly, leaving a faint scuff mark on the pristine, polished marble floor. She stood there, breathing heavily, the pain pulsing in her arm, the torn silk of her glove hanging in pathetic shreds around her fingers. The boutique fell dead, terrifyingly silent. Across the room, Mrs. Sterling was lazily flipping through a rack of imported winter coats. She hadn't even turned around. She was entirely unbothered by the violence, acting as if the physical assault that had just occurred mere feet away from her was simply the hired help taking out the garbage. Arthur stood in the center of the room, panting slightly, his chest heaving as he frantically adjusted the lapels of his tight gray suit, trying to smooth out the wrinkles. He looked at Mamie standing by the door with a smug, victorious, deeply ugly sneer twisting his features. He felt powerful. He had won. He had successfully protected his sanctuary from the invading element. "Take your garbage back uptown where it belongs," Arthur spat, the venom dripping from his words. He turned his back on her, a final gesture of ultimate dismissal. "Sal, lock the door behind her." Mamie stood perfectly still by the exit. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't throw a panicked tantrum or threaten to call the police. The police didn't handle matters like this. Her husband handled matters like this. She slowly, deliberately raised her left hand. She stared down at the torn, ruined, jagged white silk hanging off her fingers. She felt the heavy, angry, dark purple bruise that was already swelling against her skin, a hot brand of disrespect burning into her flesh. Then she slowly raised her head. She didn't look at Mrs. Sterling. She didn't spare another glance for the breathtaking red dress she had come to buy. She looked at Sal, the mob muscle. She stared into his dead eyes. She meticulously traced the rough, broken lines of his heavy jaw, the crooked shape of his nose, the exact placement of his feet. She burned his image, his scent, and his violent energy deep into her flawless, photographic memory. Then, her dark, freezing eyes shifted across the room to Arthur. She memorized the thin, pathetic line of his mustache. She memorized the arrogant, cowardly posture of his spine. She memorized the specific, pathetic shade of his ill-fitting gray suit. She committed every single atom of his being to a file in her mind, a file she was about to hand directly over to the most dangerous man in New York City. Mamie Johnson slowly reached out with her uninjured right hand and calmly pushed down on the heavy brass handle of the front door. The silver bell chimed one last time, a mournful, ringing sound. She stepped halfway out onto the bustling, sunlit sidewalk, letting the warm, humid spring air wash over her face, clearing the stench of the boutique from her lungs. Then she stopped. She didn't walk away. She turned her head slowly, looking back into the heavily draped, luxurious interior of the boutique. She locked eyes with Arthur. Suddenly, Arthur froze. The smug, victorious sneer melted off his face like wax held to a flame. He felt a sudden, inexplicable, freezing shiver run violently down his spine. The woman he had just ordered assaulted wasn't looking at him with fear. She wasn't looking at him with shame. She was looking at him with the cold, absolute, terrifying certainty of a predator staring at a trapped animal. Mamie didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke just loud enough for the precise acoustic design of the marble room to carry her words, sharp and clear, directly into the center of Arthur's chest. "You have absolutely no idea whose air you are breathing right now," Mamie whispered. Her voice sounded like heavy, jagged glass grinding slowly against stone. "Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Arthur. Take a very long, very close look around your beautiful, expensive store. Memorize every crystal in those chandeliers, because it is the last peaceful day you will ever experience on this earth." Arthur swallowed hard, a thick, terrified lump suddenly forming in his throat. His instincts, buried deep beneath his snobbery, were screaming at him that he had just made a catastrophic, unfixable error. But his fragile, bloated ego wouldn't allow him to retreat or apologize in front of his wealthy client. "Get out," Arthur yelled, his voice cracking, revealing the sudden, desperate fear clawing at his insides. Mamie didn't reply. She simply stepped fully out onto the pavement and let the heavy, thick glass door swing shut behind her. The heavy thud of the door ceiling was the sound of a judge bringing down a gavel. The fate of everyone inside that room was now sealed. She turned and walked slowly, deliberately toward the idling Lincoln Continental parked at the curb. Tommy, who had been leaning against the front fender smoking a cigarette, saw her approaching. He immediately flicked the cigarette into the gutter, stood up straight, and smiled, reaching out to pull the heavy rear door open for her. But as Mamie drew closer, the bright, respectful smile vanished instantly from the young driver's face. Tommy saw it all in a fraction of a second. He saw the torn, jagged white silk hanging in pathetic shreds from her left hand. He saw the way Mamie was favoring her left arm, holding it tightly and protectively against her stomach, her posture rigid with contained pain. As she briefly loosened her grip on her stomach to reach for the doorframe with her left hand, the navy blue cuff of her Chanel suit slid up just a fraction of an inch. Tommy saw the dark, ugly, violently purple bruise forming violently against her skin. Tommy's blood turned instantly to ice. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sick. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked past Mamie, his wide, panicked eyes staring at the gold leaf lettering on the window of the boutique. And then he looked back down at the terrible, undeniable bruise on Mamie's arm. He knew exactly what that bruise meant. It wasn't just a physical injury. It wasn't an accident. It was a formal, blood-soaked declaration of war. Someone in that building had put their hands on the Queen of Harlem. "Mrs. Johnson," Tommy stammered, his voice cracking, his hands literally shaking as he gripped the chrome handle of the car door. He felt sick to his stomach. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to pull his weapon and storm the building right then and there. Did someone in there put their hands on you?" Mamie didn't look at him. She didn't look back at the store. She stared straight ahead, looking down the long, gray, endlessly stretching concrete river of Fifth Avenue, pointing directly north, back toward the territory they controlled. Her dark eyes were completely empty of fear, empty of sadness, and filled to the absolute brim with the cold, heavy, unbreakable certainty of the violence that was about to rain down on the men who had disrespected her. "Just drive, Tommy," Mamie said quietly, her voice devoid of all emotion as she slid gracefully into the cool leather sanctuary of the back seat. "Do not stop for lights. Do not stop for traffic. Take me home to my husband." Tommy didn't say another word. He slammed the heavy rear door shut with a ferocious, angry force. He didn't walk around to the driver's side. He practically sprinted, his polished shoes slapping hard against the pavement. He threw himself behind the wheel and slammed the heavy gear shift into drive. He pressed his foot down hard on the accelerator. The massive, powerful engine of the Lincoln roared to life with a deafening sound, like a crack of thunder breaking over the city streets. The heavy white wall tires squealed violently against the pavement, burning rubber as the massive car tore aggressively away from the curb. They left the quiet, hushed, arrogant luxury of Fifth Avenue behind them in a cloud of blue exhaust smoke. The car sped recklessly north, weaving through the midday traffic, crossing the invisible lines of the city, carrying a deadly, terrifying message written in bruised, aching skin and torn, ruined silk. Arthur, the boutique manager, had kicked a woman out of his store to appease a socialite. He thought he had successfully defended his territory. He thought he was dealing with a nobody, a ghost from uptown who would simply vanish into the wind. He didn't know the name Bumpy Johnson. He didn't know the rules of the streets. And he certainly didn't know that by the time the sun set over the Hudson River tonight, the devil himself was coming downtown to collect the debt. The Lincoln Continental hit 110th Street, crossing the invisible border back into Harlem, the heavy white wall tires spinning against the asphalt with a desperate, urgent rhythm. The massive engine roared beneath the hood, a mechanical beast straining against its leash, and with every passing city block, the clock began to tick down on Maison Delore. Inside the cavernous, leather-scented interior of the vehicle, the air was completely devoid of oxygen. It was a vacuum of thick, suffocating tension. Tommy's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were completely white, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking at the traffic behind them. He was looking at Mamie. She sat perfectly still in the center of the bench seat. She was a statue carved from dark obsidian, staring straight ahead at the partition. She hadn't spoken a single word since they left the curb on Fifth Avenue. She simply held her left arm close to her torso, the ruined, shredded remains of the white silk glove hanging limply from her fingers. The dark, violently purple bruise on her wrist was now fully formed, a stark, ugly brand against her skin. It throbbed with a dull, heavy heat, but Mamie's face betrayed nothing. There was no pain in her eyes, only a terrifying, infinite depth of cold calculation. Tommy navigated the busy, vibrant streets of Harlem with reckless precision. He bypassed their private apartment building entirely. He knew exactly where Ellsworth Johnson would be at this hour of the afternoon. He pulled the Lincoln sharply into the alleyway behind the Flash Inn, the tires kicking up a spray of loose gravel. The Flash Inn was a legendary Harlem establishment, a high-class supper club where the music was loud, the drinks were strong, and the back rooms served as the central nervous system for Bumpy Johnson's empire. Before Tommy could even throw the heavy car into park, the back door swung open. Mamie stepped out into the humid alleyway. She didn't wait for her driver. She didn't adjust her suit. She walked with a singular, terrifying purpose toward the heavy steel security door at the rear of the building. Two of Bumpy's soldiers, wearing sharp suits and fedoras pulled low, were stationed by the door, smoking cigarettes and keeping watch. When they saw Mamie approaching, the casual, relaxed posture vanished instantly. They dropped their cigarettes, crushing them under polished shoes, and stood at rigid attention. "Afternoon, Mrs. Johnson," the taller one said, his voice thick with respect as he reached out to pull the heavy steel door open. Mamie didn't reply. She didn't even look at them. She simply glided past them into the dimly lit, smoke-filled hallway of the club. The soldiers exchanged a brief, panicked look. They had seen the torn glove. They had felt the freezing absolute zero drop in temperature as she walked by. They knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that someone was going to die today. Mamie walked through the bustling kitchen, ignoring the clatter of pots and the shouts of the chefs. She moved directly to the narrow, carpeted staircase that led to the private offices on the second floor. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the wooden steps, a sound that echoed like the ticking of a metronome, counting down to 0. At the top of the stairs, there was a heavy, solid oak door. Standing directly in front of it, leaning casually against the wall with his arms crossed, was Junie Bard. Junie was Bumpy's right hand, his shadow, and the most universally feared enforcer north of Central Park. He was a man carved from solid, immovable rock, possessing a quiet, deadly stillness that made the air around him feel dangerously thin. Junie didn't speak often, because when Junie moved, words were no longer necessary. As Mamie reached the landing, Junie slowly uncrossed his arms. His dark, heavy-lidded eyes scanned her from head to toe. It took him exactly 1/10 of a second to register the jagged, ruined silk on her left hand and the way she held her arm. Junie Bard stopped breathing. The terrifying, absolute stillness of the enforcer deepened. His jaw tightened so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply reached out a massive, calloused hand, wrapped his fingers around the brass doorknob of the oak door, and pushed it open for her. The private office was a large, elegantly appointed room that smelled of expensive Cuban cigars, old leather, and bay rum aftershave. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, lit only by a pair of green glass banker's lamps that cast long, ominous shadows across the walls. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Bumpy Johnson. He was in the middle of a meeting. 3 men, lieutenants from the Bronx who ran the numbers rackets, were sitting in chairs opposite the desk, nervously pitching a new expansion strategy. Bumpy was leaning back in his leather chair, a lit cigar held loosely between his fingers, listening to them with half an ear, his brilliant, tactical mind already 10 steps ahead of their petty ambitions. When the heavy oak door swung open, the 3 lieutenants immediately stopped talking, annoyed by the interruption. But when they turned and saw who was standing in the doorway, the annoyance instantly evaporated into sheer, unadulterated terror. Mamie stepped fully into the light of the banker's lamps. Bumpy's eyes shifted from the men to his wife. For a moment, the room was suspended in an agonizing, heavy silence. The king of Harlem took a long, slow draw from his cigar, the tip glowing a bright, angry cherry red in the dim light. He exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke, watching it drift toward the ceiling. Then his eyes traveled down. They moved past the tailored lines of her navy blue Chanel suit, past the genuine pearls resting on her collarbone, and locked entirely onto her left hand. He saw the torn silk. He saw the dark, ugly, violent bruise swelling against her wrist. The shift in Bumpy Johnson was not loud. It was not explosive. He didn't slam his fists on the desk. He didn't raise his voice and scream to the heavens. Instead, the man became terrifyingly, unnaturally quiet. The temperature in the room plummeted so fast the 3 lieutenants practically shivered. The air pressure changed, growing incredibly heavy, pressing against their eardrums. It was the specific, horrifying quiet of a deep ocean trench right before a tectonic plate snaps. Bumpy slowly leaned forward. He reached out and meticulously, carefully placed his cigar into the crystal ashtray on his desk, making sure the glowing cherry didn't touch the glass. He didn't look at the three men from the Bronx. "Leave," Bumpy whispered. The word was barely louder than a breath, but it carried the concussive force of a shotgun blast. The three lieutenants didn't hesitate. They didn't ask to finish their presentation. They didn't even gather their paperwork. They stood up so fast one of the heavy wooden chairs scraped violently against the floorboards and practically sprinted for the door, squeezing past Junie Bird and disappearing down the stairs as if their lives depended on it. The door clicked shut, leaving only Bumpy, Mamie, and the silent, looming presence of Junie in the room. Bumpy stood up from his desk. He walked around the heavy mahogany furniture with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped 2 feet in front of his wife. He didn't reach out to touch her. He knew better than to crowd her space when she had just been violated. He simply looked at her eyes, reading the cold, furious geometry of her thoughts. "Tell me," Bumpy said. His voice was a flat, dead baritone, utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a judge reading a death sentence. Mamie stood perfectly straight. She didn't let a single tear form in her eyes. She delivered the information with the precise, tactical efficiency of a military commander briefing a general. Maison Delore. 5th Avenue, near 57th Street, Mamie said, her voice smooth and unbroken. "A man named Arthur. He is the manager. He decided my presence was an insult to his white clientele. When I refused to leave before completing my business, he instructed his private security to physically remove me." Bumpy's dark eyes flicked down to the bruise on her wrist, staring at the dark purple discoloration as if it were an alien parasite that needed to be surgically excised from the universe. "The security guard?" Bumpy asked softly. "A thick-necked brute named Sal," Mamie replied, her tone as cold as grinding ice. "He put his hands on me, Ellsworth. He grabbed me, tore my garment, and shoved me toward the street. A muscle feathered in Bumpy's jaw. It was the only physical manifestation of the absolute apocalyptic rage burning inside his chest. He slowly raised his right hand and gently, barely making contact, brushed his fingertips against the unbruised portion of her forearm. "Did you get the red dress?" Bumpy asked. "I did not," Mamie said quietly. "It is still on the center display." Bumpy nodded slowly, a dark, terrible understanding passing between them. He lowered his hand. He looked past Mamie, locking his freezing gaze onto Junie Bird, who was still standing by the door, radiating a murderous, heavy energy. "Junie," Bumpy said, the syllables dropping from his mouth like heavy stones. "Call down to the garage. I want the fleet ready in 10 minutes. Every single Cadillac. I want the trunks heavy. Tell the cats we are going downtown to do some window shopping." Junie didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply turned and vanished into the hallway, a ghost moving to execute a nightmare. Bumpy turned back to his wife. The coldness in his eyes softened just a fraction of a millimeter, replaced by a fierce, burning devotion. "Go upstairs to the apartment, Mamie. Have Maria draw you a hot bath. Pour yourself a glass of the good cognac. By the time the streetlights turn on, this city will remember exactly who you are." Mamie held his gaze. She didn't ask him what he was going to do. She already knew. "Make it completely clear to them, Ellsworth," she whispered. "Leave absolutely no room for misinterpretation." "Solid," Bumpy replied, turning back toward his desk to retrieve his fedora. "They won't just understand. They will pray they had never been born." The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the towering skyline of Manhattan, casting long, dark, grasping shadows across the concrete of the city. as Bumpy's men mobilized in the alleyway behind the Flash Inn, loading heavy canvas-wrapped packages into the trunks of 5 pristine jet-black Cadillacs. Bumpy sat in the back of his personal vehicle with Junie. But Tommy didn't point the Lincoln directly toward Fifth Avenue. Bumpy had given him a different address first, a detour. Bumpy Johnson was a grandmaster of the streets. He did not play checkers. He played a deeply layered, 30-move deep game of chess. He knew every piece on the board, and he knew exactly how the money flowed through the concrete arteries of New York. He knew that a highly exclusive, diamond-studded boutique on Fifth Avenue didn't operate in a vacuum. They didn't hire thick-necked brutes named Sal off the street corner. They paid protection. They paid a heavy, white envelope every single week to the downtown Italian mafia to ensure their glass wasn't broken by local street gangs, and Bumpy knew exactly whose territory the high 50s belonged to. The Lincoln pulled up smoothly to the curb outside a quiet, unassuming social club in East Harlem, just a few blocks from the invisible border of Italian territory. It was a place with frosted glass windows, heavily barred doors, and a reputation for making people disappear. This was the headquarters of Vinny the Grip Calabrese, a mid-level captain who handled the luxury retail extortion rackets for the downtown families. "Keep the engine running, Tommy," Bumpy said softly, adjusting the brim of his fedora as he stepped out onto the pavement. "This won't take but a minute." Junie Byard stepped out from the opposite side, the massive enforcer falling in step half a pace behind Bumpy's left shoulder. They walked to the heavy wooden door of the social club. It was locked. Bumpy didn't knock. Junie simply raised his heavy steel-toed boot and kicked the door with the force of a battering ram. The wood splintered, the lock shattered, and the door flew inward, crashing violently against the wall. The interior of the club was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of stale espresso. A dozen heavy-set men in cheap suits sat around circular tables, playing cards and counting stacks of dirty money. When the door exploded inward, they all jumped to their feet, reaching under their jackets for their weapons. But when the smoke cleared, and they saw the tailored, immaculate silhouette of Bumpy Johnson standing in the doorway, framed by the terrifying, looming bulk of Junie Byard, the hands reaching for the guns froze completely. The oxygen was sucked right out of the room. Bumpy didn't raise his hands. He didn't draw a weapon. He walked into the center of the room with the casual, bored arrogance of a man strolling through a public park. He stopped in front of the largest table, where Vinny the Grip was sitting, his face pale and sweating. "Vinny," Bumpy said, his voice a smooth, conversational purr that was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "I have a small problem, and it seems your name is attached to it." Vinny swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Junie, who was staring at him with the dead, hollow look of an executioner. "Bumpy, listen, whatever it is, we can talk about it. There's no need for disrespect. We got an understanding. Uptown is yours, downtown is ours." That was the understanding, yes, Bumpy agreed. Pulling a silver cigarette case from his jacket pocket, he tapped a cigarette against the metal, a sharp, rhythmic sound. "Until about 2 hours ago. A boutique on Fifth Avenue, Maison Delore. They pay you an envelope, don't they, Vinny? They pay you to keep the riffraff out." Vinny nodded slowly, the panic rising in his chest. Yeah, they are on my books. What about them?" The manager of that establishment, a deeply foolish man named Arthur, and a piece of your muscle named Sal, decided to put their hands on my wife today, Bumpy said, lighting his cigarette and exhaling a stream of smoke directly into Vinny's face. The silence that followed was absolute. The men in the room stopped breathing. They knew the rules. They knew the unwritten laws of the underworld. You could steal money. You could hijack trucks. You could even shoot each other in the street over territory. But you absolutely, fundamentally, never touched a man's family. And to touch the wife of Ellsworth Johnson was the equivalent of detonating a nuclear bomb in your own living room. "Oh God," Vinny whispered, all the color draining from his face. "Bumpy, I swear on my mother's eyes, I didn't know. I didn't order that. Sal is a moron. He's an animal. I'll handle it. I'll have him dealt with tonight." "No, Vinny," Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a freezing, jagged whisper. "You won't handle anything. You lack the necessary precision. I am going to handle it." Bumpy took a step closer to the table, his dark eyes locked onto Vinny's right hand, which was trembling uncontrollably on the green felt of the card table. On Vinny's pinky finger rested a heavy, ostentatious gold ring set with a massive, gaudy ruby. It was his signature. It was the ring the merchants on Fifth Avenue respected when they handed over their envelopes. "I need a token of your complete, unconditional surrender in this matter, Vinny," Bumpy said softly. "I need proof to present to the management of that boutique that their protection policy has been permanently canceled." Vinny looked down at his hand. He looked back up at Bumpy. He looked at Junie Bard, who slowly, deliberately pulled a heavy, straight razor from his coat pocket, the silver blade catching the dim light of the club. "Give me the ring, Vinny," Bumpy whispered, "or Junie will take the hand. You have exactly 3 seconds to decide." Vinny hesitated, his eyes darting frantically. It was 2 seconds too long. The camera of history does not need to linger on the visceral mechanics of the next 10 seconds. It only needs to record the sound of a grown man sobbing in absolute pathetic terror, the sickening wet thud of something heavy hitting the wooden floorboards, and the sharp metallic click of Junie Bard folding his razor closed. 3 minutes later, Bumpy Johnson walked out of the shattered front door of the social club. He didn't look back. He calmly walked to the waiting Lincoln Continental, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket. He carefully wiped a few dark crimson droplets of fresh blood off a heavy gold and ruby pinky ring, then slipped the jewelry into the deep pocket of his charcoal overcoat. He climbed into the back seat. The door slammed shut. "Are we done running errands, Mr. Johnson?" Tommy asked, his voice tight with adrenaline. "We are," Bumpy replied smoothly, looking out the tinted window as the fleet of black Cadillacs fell into formation behind them. "Take us to Fifth Avenue, Tommy. It is time to go shopping." The sun had finally set, dragging a deep velvet twilight over the concrete canyons of Midtown Manhattan. The streetlights flickered on, casting pools of bright artificial yellow light onto the gray pavement of Fifth Avenue. Inside Maison Delore, the atmosphere was one of profound, arrogant satisfaction. Arthur, the manager, was standing behind the heavy glass and brass jewelry counter, meticulously counting the day's receipts. He had locked the heavy front door 20 minutes ago. The delicate silver bell was silent. The store was closed. It had been a wildly successful afternoon. Mrs. Sterling, the wealthy socialite, had purchased not 1, but 3 imported winter coats, dropping a sum of money that would cover the boutique's rent for the next 6 months. Arthur felt invincible. He felt like a titan of retail. He poured himself a small glass of expensive scotch from a crystal decanter hidden under the counter, swirling the amber liquid and smiling at his own reflection in the mirror. He had successfully defended his sanctuary. He had kept the undesirables out, proving his worth to his elite clientele. The brief, unpleasant incident with the woman from uptown was already fading from his memory, dismissed as nothing more than a minor annoyance handled with necessary firmness. Sal, the massive, thick-necked guard, was leaning heavily against the wall near the back dressing rooms. He was slowly unwrapping a piece of cheap chewing gum, completely oblivious to the world, looking forward to clocking out and hitting the bars downtown. He had forgotten about the woman the moment he pushed her out the door. To Sal, violence wasn't memorable, it was just a physical reflex. Arthur raised his glass of scotch, preparing to take a celebratory sip. Then, the ambient noise of the city changed. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a low, heavy, unnatural vibration that seemed to roll down the asphalt and seep straight through the marble floorboards of the boutique. It was the sound of 6 massive, high-powered American V8 engines idling in perfect, terrifying unison. Arthur paused, the rim of the crystal glass hovering an inch from his lips. He frowned, annoyed by the disturbance. He slowly turned his head and looked out the massive plate glass front windows of the store. The glass of scotch slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, the amber liquid splashing violently across his polished leather shoes. Arthur couldn't breathe. His lungs felt as though they had been filled with wet cement. Outside, the pristine, quiet stretch of Fifth Avenue had been completely transformed into a militarized zone. A fleet of 6 identical jet-black Cadillacs had pulled up in a tight, impenetrable line, aggressively boxing in the entire storefront. They were parked illegally, half up on the curb, blocking the sidewalk completely. Their bright, high-beam headlights were blazing, cutting through the twilight and completely flooding the interior of the boutique with a harsh, blinding, interrogating white light. It looked like a funeral procession designed in hell. Sal Arthur croaked, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual arrogant sneer. "Sal, look." Sal pushed himself off the wall, his thick brow furrowing in confusion. He lumbered heavily toward the front windows, his hand instinctively reaching toward his waistband, where he kept his heavy revolver. He squinted against the blinding glare of the high beams. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, the heavy doors of all 6 Cadillacs opened at the exact same moment. 30 men stepped out onto the pavement. They did not look like the wealthy patrons of Fifth Avenue. They did not wear gray flannel suits or carry leather briefcases. They were the ghosts of Harlem, men forged in the fires of the uptown underworld. They wore dark trench coats, fedoras pulled low over their eyes, and expressions of absolute chilling indifference. They didn't shout. They didn't wave weapons around like street thugs. They moved with the cold, silent, calculated discipline of an invading army. They formed a tight, silent semicircle around the front entrance of the boutique, their bodies blocking out the rest of the world. From the lead vehicle, the massive Lincoln Continental, a single figure emerged. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the pavement. He adjusted the lapels of his immaculate charcoal overcoat. He didn't rush. He walked with the slow, deliberate, heavy gait of a god descending from Olympus to punish the mortals. Beside him, like a towering, inescapable shadow, walked Junie Bird. Inside the boutique, the air pressure dropped to 0. Arthur felt his knees physically buckle, his hands desperately gripping the edge of the glass counter to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. A cold, nauseating sweat broke out across his forehead. He didn't know the man's name, but he recognized the aura. He recognized the absolute unchecked power radiating from the figure approaching his door. He suddenly remembered the cold, dead eyes of the woman he had thrown out earlier that day. "You have absolutely no idea whose air you are breathing right now." The words echoed in Arthur's mind like a funeral bell. Bumpy walked directly up to the heavy glass door. He stopped. He looked through the glass, his dark eyes locking on to Arthur, who was trembling visibly behind the counter. Bumpy reached out and casually pushed the brass handle. The door was locked. Bumpy didn't rattle it. He didn't knock. He simply took half a step back and looked at Junie Bird. Junie didn't hesitate. He raised his heavy, steel-toed boot and kicked the heavy plate glass door dead center. The reinforced glass held for a microsecond before detonating inward with a deafening, concussive crash, raining jagged shards across the pristine white marble floor. Junie calmly reached his massive hand through the jagged hole, grasped the heavy deadbolt, and twisted it open. He pushed the ruined brass frame wide. The delicate silver bell chimed, a pathetic, musical sound entirely drowned out by the crunching of broken glass beneath heavy boots. Bumpy Johnson walked into Maison Delore. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone was a weapon of mass destruction. He slowly took off his fedora, revealing his close-cropped graying hair, and began to casually, meticulously inspect the interior of the boutique. He looked at the crystal chandeliers, the velvet drapery, the headless mannequins. He looked at everything except the two terrified men standing in front of him. "Nice place," Bumpy said. His voice was a low, smooth, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. "A bit drafty now, though. You should probably get that door fixed." Arthur opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to call for the police, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by terror. Sal, the thick-necked muscle, was the only one whose survival instincts overrode his fear. He took a heavy, aggressive step forward, pulling the heavy revolver clear of his waistband. "Hey, you can't just bust in here, you jive." Before Sal could finish the sentence, before he could even raise the barrel of the gun, Junie Bird moved. It was terrifying to witness a man of that immense size move with such blinding, fluid speed. Junie crossed the 15 feet of marble floor in a split second. He didn't draw a gun. He simply grabbed Sal by the throat with his left hand, his massive fingers wrapping entirely around the guard's thick neck, cutting off his airway instantly. With his right hand, Junie casually swatted the heavy revolver out of Sal's grip. The gun clattered uselessly across the marble floor. Junie squeezed. Sal's eyes bulged, his face turning a deep, violent shade of purple. Junie held him there for a terrifying moment, then casually tossed his unconscious body onto the marble floor, where he lay completely motionless. Bumpy didn't even blink. He didn't break his stride. He walked slowly, deliberately up to the glass jewelry counter, stopping directly across from the trembling, weeping manager. "Are you Arthur?" Bumpy asked softly, placing his fedora on top of the glass display case. Arthur nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Yes, I'm Arthur. Please don't hurt me. Take whatever you want. Take the jewelry. Take the cash in the register. Just leave." Bumpy sighed, a soft, deeply disappointed sound. He leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the glass. "Arthur, you are operating under a severe, fatal misconception. I am not a thief. I am a businessman. And earlier today, you fundamentally disrespected a highly valued member of my organization. You insulted her, you refused her service, and you allowed that animal over there to place his filthy hands upon her." Arthur's mind raced, desperately searching for a lifeline, any shield he could hide behind. His bloated, fragile ego grabbed onto the only power he knew. You can't do this," Arthur stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Bumpy. "Do you know who protects this store? Do you know whose territory you are standing in? I pay the Italians. I pay Vinnie Calabrese. If you touch me, if you take one thing from this store, the downtown families will bury you under the river." Arthur's voice rose to a hysterical, desperate shriek. He thought mentioning the mafia would act as a magic spell, instantly terrifying this uptown interloper into retreating. Bumpy Johnson just smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a cold, razor-thin stretching of the lips that held zero warmth. He slowly reached into the deep pocket of his charcoal overcoat. He pulled his hand out and held his closed fist over the pristine glass of the jewelry counter. "Arthur," Bumpy whispered, his voice dropping to a register that froze the blood in Arthur's veins. "Your insurance policy has been permanently canceled." Bumpy opened his hand. A heavy object dropped from his palm. It hit the glass counter with a sharp, heavy clack, rolled slightly, and came to a stop directly under the bright, interrogating light of the chandelier. Arthur stared at it. His brain violently rejected the information his eyes were sending him. It was a heavy, ostentatious gold pinky ring set with a massive, gaudy ruby. It was the ring Vinnie had violently pressed into his cheek the day he established his protection rates, but the gold was no longer shining. The ring was heavily, thickly smeared with dark, drying, crimson blood. Small, wet droplets of it stained the pristine glass of the display case. Arthur stared at the bloodied ring of his protector. The absolute, undeniable reality of his situation finally crushed him. The invisible walls of privilege, money, and mafia protection that had shielded him his entire life shattered into a million pieces. He was entirely, utterly alone in a room with a monster he had personally invited in. Arthur fell to his knees behind the counter, sobbing hysterically, burying his face in his trembling hands. Bumpy looked down at the pathetic, broken man. He didn't feel pity. He felt nothing but a cold, necessary logic. He picked up his fedora, settled it perfectly on his head, and slowly turned his head to look back at the 30 men standing silently outside the shattered doorway. Bumpy raised his right hand and gave a single brief nod. The destruction of Maison Delore did not begin with a roar. It began with a terrifying, methodical silence. The men from Harlem stepped over the threshold, pulling heavy steel crowbars and wooden batons from beneath their coats. They did not shout. They did not cheer. They moved with the cold, brutal efficiency of a demolition crew dismantling a condemned building. The sound was apocalyptic. The first heavy swing of a steel crowbar shattered a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror, sending thousands of jagged daggers of glass raining down onto the marble floor. Another soldier calmly walked down the line of headless mannequins, taking a razor-sharp switchblade and meticulously, systematically slashing the imported silk and velvet gowns to absolute ribbons. Crash. The heavy glass display cases holding the imported jewelry and brooches were smashed into powder, the expensive diamonds completely ignored, left to mix with the debris on the floor. Rip. The deep crimson velvet drapery lining the walls was violently torn down, exposing the bare plaster underneath. The heavy crystal chandeliers were brought crashing down from the ceiling, plunging the store into jagged, shifting shadows illuminated only by the glaring headlights of the Cadillacs outside. It was a symphony of targeted, catastrophic violence. They were tearing the arrogance out of the building by its roots. They were erasing the boutique from existence. Arthur remained on his knees behind the counter, his hands covering his ears, screaming uselessly against the deafening roar of his entire life being systematically dismantled around him. Through the chaos, the flying glass, and the falling velvet, Bumpy Johnson walked with slow, unbothered strides. He moved to the center display. The breathtaking, blood-red silk gown was still there, untouched by the destruction swirling around it. Bumpy looked at it, admiring the craftsmanship. He carefully unhooked the dress from the display mannequin, draping the heavy, expensive silk carefully over his left arm, ensuring it didn't touch the ruined, debris-covered floor. He slowly walked back to the jewelry counter. The noise in the boutique began to instantly fade as his men recognized he was finished. The crowbars lowered. The tearing stopped. The silence that returned to the room was heavier, thicker, and far more terrifying than the noise had been. Bumpy leaned over the shattered remains of the glass counter, looking down at Arthur, who was curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the floor. "Look at me," Bumpy commanded. The tone was absolute zero. Arthur slowly, agonizingly raised his head, his face streaked with tears and dust, his eyes wide with an animalistic terror. Bumpy reached into his inner suit pocket with his free hand. He pulled out a massive, thick wad of $100 bills, bound tightly with a heavy rubber band. He looked Arthur dead in the eyes, holding his gaze until he saw the man's soul completely shattered. Bumpy dropped the wad of cash. It hit Arthur squarely in the center of his chest, a heavy, blunt impact that made the manager flinch. Bumpy leaned in closer, the scent of expensive bay rum and cold iron washing over Arthur. He whispered with an ice-cold precision that would haunt the manager's nightmares for the rest of his natural life. "My wife liked the red dress. Consider it paid for." Bumpy paused, letting the words sink in, letting the absolute terror solidify in the air between them. He glanced over at Junie, standing near the unconscious guard. "And if anyone ever touches her again," Bumpy whispered, his voice scraping against the ruined acoustics of the boutique, "I won't just break their hands. I'll take their arms." Bumpy stood up straight. He turned his back on the ruined sanctuary. He walked out the shattered front door, the heavy red silk of the gown draped over his arm, his men parting silently to let the king pass. He stepped into the back of the waiting Lincoln Continental. The doors of the Cadillac slammed shut in unison, the massive engines roared, and the fleet pulled away from the curb, melting back into the shadows of the city, leaving nothing behind but shattered glass, torn velvet, and a terrifying, undeniable message etched into the concrete of Fifth Avenue. No one touched Mamie Johnson.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.